Thank you for coming and being our guest.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a real privilege to be here. It's my first time in Cairo, first time in Egypt, and so I'm going to speak very much from a North American vantage point, but I'm sure smart students can make the translation, and I hope that some of what I say will be useful. Some will be insightful, and you can discard the stuff that isn't relevant. So thank you very much once again. I'm going to speak based on a research project over 7 years, which involved about 100 researchers comparing peri-urban development, or the development around cities. We started with the idea of a kind of global suburbanism. And we looked at that, but in that word suburb, there are so many presuppositions about North American suburbs, European suburbs, that don't apply to other countries, and so many presuppositions about the relationship between the city and the countryside, which are specifically Western and even North America. One of the key presuppositions we have, especially in 20th century suburban development in North America and late 19th century development of the garden city, garden suburb, is this idea of having a new relationship with nature. Suburbs developed to try to get the best of both worlds, both being close to urban amenities and also in fresh air and lots of space, and especially related to the urban tradition in the United States, in particular, a kind of historical development which really elevated nature and having a lot of space around houses as a kind of very high cultural value. Between the city and the countryside, this rural agricultural countryside, you had suburbia, somehow a kind of in-between space. You can see in this picture, this is the city where I'm teaching, the University of Alberta, where you are all very welcome. And it has a traditional central business district, quite compact, built up. And then these, you see in these green leaves, these are the suburbs of the 1950s and 1960s. And then in the inset photograph, you see the suburbia of the 1990s as it's developing further away from the city, but is continuing to sprawl and extend on the Canadian prairie. And in a way, there's a certain similarity with a city like Cairo, in the sense that there's a desert and there's a sense that there's space there. So if you can extend the infrastructure, then there's land. In Canada, in the case of Edmonton, it's some of the best agricultural land in North America. So we're building houses on top of farmers' fields, which leads to increasing issues around food supply. Especially this was an industrial, agricultural region, so we're taking land out of production, especially losing wheat production. Zooming out, you get more of a sense of how the city circles the downtown and also that traditional development. The traditional pattern of the city center, suburbs, out to more rural and agricultural areas. We still operate with this stereotype, but in many ways this stereotype doesn't even describe this city, and it doesn't even describe the photograph you're looking at. Because in the foreground, in the suburban areas, are all kinds of sites of employment. And so people don't live in suburbia primarily because they simply can't afford to live closer to the city center, but these suburbs are closer to where they actually work. There's a lot of light manufacturing, and that's not in the city center. It's on the outskirts of the city. And so people are choosing to live in suburbs because suburbs are actually mixed-use development. The old stereotype of just a residential zone no longer fits with the nature of these suburbs. There's another assumption we make about these suburbs, just to talk about how our research assumptions, our research questions, were in many ways shown to be irrelevant to what we were studying. We assume that these are single-family homes, but we find increasingly in Canada we have a mix of immigrants, and so people move to Canada, they get a job or someone does a degree and they stay, and then they bring their parents because the healthcare is free, and they want a house and a bigger house, so they borrow some money from their uncle who invests, and so you have up to 11 people on the title of the property. And in these houses you have quite complex family structures. Cousins, relatives, people staying for a year, people staying for 3 months, grandmothers who come for 3 months and then go home. So it's a much more lively, multi-ethnic environment. But 1/3 of the houses have no children in them. The children have all grown up and moved away, and so these are what we call empty nesters. So demographically, this is not the suburb of the 1960s. So this is to say that almost everything you read in a textbook about a North American suburb is now incorrect. It's incorrect socially, it's incorrect economically. The only thing there standing is the houses. Perhaps there's a few more trees than they used to have. That's how, almost the same general location, same place, 1970. Houses under construction in a suburb called Millwoods outside of Edmonton. You're probably more familiar with earlier suburbs, late in the 1940s and early 50s, such as Levittown. Levittown is in the textbooks. It's really the beginning of the industrial production of suburbia. Right? These houses, in this case, are partly built by the owners, but the houses look very similar to the houses that were created, or the design typologies which were created in the early 1950s by this company, the Levitt Brothers Building Company, that built large tracts of suburban housing with very few facilities for people returning from service in the Second World War. Here's Edmonton, again 1969, later, with the same idea. So this idea of the Levittown suburb was built all over North America, and it was built on an industrial scale. So even today, if you recall the suburbia of 2015 or so, the little inset picture, those houses take precisely 118 days to construct. And this industrialized nature is built partly not only on the availability of space, but also on time. Because the builders must borrow the money to buy the land and to keep the land for 118 days and then sell it to a homeowner so that they can pay off their bank loan. On day 120, the builder is losing money, right, at the rate of thousands a day. 121, by 130, it's literally a disaster. 180, the builder is bankrupt. So it's really a very time-sensitive, as well as an industry that's built on the consumption of space, which you would expect in architecture. but we often don't think about the time aspect. I'm going to try to add in things that we don't think about or that we haven't thought about, I'd say, in my very humble opinion. And your professors are reading the same books as I am, so they can fill in on this as well and can give their comment as well, because they are experts. When we created in North America, this is Canada in the winter, so there's snow, it's not sand. We created suburbs like this, nested cul-de-sacs, crescents that interlock, that the houses built in 1969 or 1965 now look like this. This is the house I was living in until very recently. In the winter, we have to shovel the snow. And for a younger generation, shoveling the snow is increasingly not popular. So you don't have to shovel the whole lawn, just the walkway, but it's still not popular. It's relatively expensive to heat. This house has 12 inches, I don't know, about this much of insulation, and 3 panes of glass, triple glazing. So it's been upgraded, but for most people, this is an expensive project of a building that isn't environmentally functional anymore. It has only this much, when they were built, they had this much insulation, 4 inches, and maybe 1 or 2 panes of glass. The sun, they overheat in the summer, they're cold in the winter. They're heated inefficiently with oil. This one's changed to natural gas. So there have been many upgrades necessary to keep these suburban homes operating efficiently and affordable. So if you own one, you go home and you start working at one thing or another always, as every house has things to do. So this form of development has some question marks over it. The suburban house detached. In the 60s and 70s, about 97% of the residences constructed were detached housing. What's popular now is housing that is attached, or 1, 2, or 3 houses, with a little bit less need for maintenance and shoveling that's in the same area. However, cities continue to expand, and they're expanding in Canada to spread out in space. And I want to talk a bit about that. In our research, we found that while it's well known that we've recently passed approximately the 50% mark in terms of urban population. So we're now an urban planet. What is less well known is that the expansion in population has not been in city centers, it's been in peri-urban areas. So we're a peri-urban planet. And the majority of people, even in Canada, now live in apartment buildings. So we are a planet that is peri-urban, living in some kind of apartment building in general, and a kind of global average. I'm not sure about the specifics of Egypt. And so there's a lot of variation from that median. You know that the Chinese population has been urbanized, right, into peri-urban apartment towers, and they will completely skew the figures into apartment development. But it's similar in Canada. The construction of apartment buildings completely skews the figures, so the averages shift towards apartments. However, so we can say though that as the global average population density is going up, as overall population is going up, because people are living around the city in peri-urban areas, the density overall is going down. Cairo is incredibly dense, but I think that the peri-urban areas are much less dense, much more space around. So the built-up footprint globally, compared to globally, it's about twice what the density is in Europe and Japan, and 4 times what it is in the United States, Canada, and Australia. So we have about, generally a doubling of the average urban population in the 20th century. But in the 20th century, the cities expanded 16 times. So that's 2 to 16. That's the real period of sprawl. The prediction is that the global urban population will double again in 43 years, so by around 2050. But the built-up land cover, the cities, they double in only 16 years. So in simple terms, between 2000 and 2030, the population doubles, with twice the number of people, in 3 times the amount of land in cities. Cities triple, and the population doubles. So we're still expanding, and on the basis of this, there are we see several responses. You could say that you see around Cairo this process of the city tripling in size. Since our data in 2013, which was part of the Global Suburbanisms Project. There are a couple of responses. I want to talk about the pros and the cons of the responses. This is the population focus, right? We haven't talked about infrastructure or buildings yet, like the use of space. This is just assuming the population is increasing and they're using more space. Why? Please keep in mind this question, why are they using more space? Why is that happening? The proposal from Soliangel, whose figures these are, is that cities should simply annex the land, triple the size, annex that land, and lay out virtually on GIS maps, lay out a new city, lay out the extension of the city, the peri-urban development, put down the streets, the squares, the places where there will be public facilities, civic infrastructure, and do that now, before developers arrive. The problem, and perhaps even farmers could be told, well, you should plant trees or make markers about where streets will be to start to organize the landscape already. The problem is that there are already people occupying that land. It's not just the desert, and even, I suspect, the desert is not completely empty. So the idea, the proposal in a way, it's a kind of the American World Bank vision of the future is that you lay a grid work around every city, you reserve the land, and then when you get better organized peri-urban expansion. The problem is that it ignores the people who are already there, simply moves them aside in top-down planning. So I think that inevitably this causes friction and is in many countries and many cities unworkable. It's also a universal global solution, so it's a kind of Manhattan version for the whole world. You lay down the grid and you just let people expand into it. The other problem is that we know that the result is not immediate development, but kind of haphazard leapfrogging development, partial development. It creates a lot of interstitial land, a lot of half-used spaces, and it doesn't develop so evenly. A second problem is that if you lay down a plan for a street, then immediately on either side of that street, the land is more valuable. You've created value. Does that make sense? If I lay this, for example, this roadway here, and I say there will be no connections, then this land with a bridge and a connection becomes extremely valuable, and obviously a great place for a shopping mall. Right? It creates new patterns of value in the landscape, which then starts to push people around. People start to skip from here, leaving this empty, and build here first in order to capture the advantage of emerging markets. And once one builds roads, it attracts further development. And it, of course, requires cars to get there. The assumption is car-based. One way or another, that grid is a street grid, and it's a 20th century street grid where already Google and Uber are telling us cars may be self-driving, and even though it will take many years to before those self-driving cars actually become a dominant part of the total vehicle fleet. In other words, they don't replace all at once. It happens slowly, slowly. So by 2050, you only have about 30% self-driving cars. So that slow process, we're still building as if we were in 1965. My expectation is that we end up in a kind of a hybrid city-countryside blend, which is both urban and rural, and a kind of pan-urban. We need a new language to describe this. Let's call it pan-urban for now. Pan-urban in the sense that it's not urban, it's not rural, but it's this hybrid between the two. The effect is that our sense of the city starts to change. There's the traditional city, and then there's this new pan-urban condition which includes agriculture and industry in it. It's a kind of a mixed-up space. It needs entirely new ways of thinking about space, thinking about planning, and it needs new tools. That's for your generation. These are things that you're going to be dealing with how to deal with these mixed use of hybrid spaces. Even in the center of the city, we're seeing changes in the nature of the urban. You might have studied a theorist named Henri Lefebvre. He's a French urbanist. Does that name ring a bell? Lefebvre? He's the person who separates the city and the urban. Cities are built, tangible things. It's the built environment. The urban is intangible. It's a virtuality. It's that shared sense we get of the great city. The urban is a theoretical object. It's an object of research. The city is something you build. So when I say urban, I'm thinking quite theoretically about this intangible quality of urbanness. So you could be in a city which isn't very urban. And I think that's what we're seeing created, is cities that are somehow not quite urban. They have this very loose spatial framework, very low density. And because of problems of food security, we're going to be forced to incorporate agriculture into them. I'm sorry I put all the writing on one page. Maybe I can leave this PowerPoint with your professors and you can read it. But essentially, one of the problems we have, I believe, is in physical planning. We planned the city, but we didn't plan the urban. And physical planning also didn't think about implementation. We didn't think about construction or the realities of construction or economics or politics. So this is like an additional set of tools that, for example, in Canada, planners focus on the legal framework of master planning and then zoning, but they have no training in land economics or in urban politics. So they're always shocked when they discover the political realities or the economics of development. We also tend to assume that housing doesn't need to be planned. It's something that families do on their own for themselves, and we take a project by project point of view. So there have been a whole series of these of these factors which tend to create peri-urban development, and it's creating that development without us thinking about it very much. There are many economic incentives to developers. We don't study land in terms of capital, in terms of money. So I'm saying you have to pay attention to power and money. And that suggests new ways of looking at the city. And I think also we should look at subsidies for transport. And so I want to talk a little bit about the car and these kind of environments that have this mixed use, kind of semi-planned quality. Think about the car, old car. Everybody wants a car. So in a world where there are more and more cars, cars in some way are not a clear focus when we come to talk about peri-urbanization. But roadways are a huge part of urban development. We think about the space used up in roads. It's an enormous part of peri-urban development. I've been studying failed shopping centers, failed retail environments, and how we can revitalize spaces like this. Talk a bit about this. But the biggest use of land in these shopping centers is the parking lot. And it's free parking, and that free parking is only available in suburbia, in peri-urban areas, and so we have a hidden subsidy to the retailers located there compared to the retailers located in the city center, where you have to pay for parking, and can be quite expensive. So the car represents not just mobility, but a system of subsidies, which I think that we've neglected. We forget that the street went from something that looked like that to something that was crowded like this. Right? This is not Cairo. But get the idea. If we imagine what we could do with this space, this parking lot, as well as the building, we ran a design competition called Strip Appeal. It's strip-appeal.com. It's a bit small, but what this shows you is it shows you, first of all, at the top on the left, it shows you something very similar kind of shopping mall building, and it's one that's completely empty. This is in Buffalo, New York State, and this is by a group of students in the School of Architecture. And what they show, starting at the top, is the very top part is a picture of the site plan. And the next, as you come down, they take the roof off the building, they start to pull the building apart. On the right-hand side, you see bundles of bricks, of beams, of roofing materials, and then it shows you in the colored diagrams, there's the bundles. It shows you what you could build out of it. You can build a whole village out of that shopping mall, out of that building. Take it apart with the land. You can build an entire village. Here are some prototypes. And in this sequence here, here's a 25-year plan. So this is one of the winners of the competition. But what they're working with is as much the site, the land area, as the building. They're turning the peri-urban city that's quite empty into a peri-urban rural peri-urban urban environment. Here's another entry, and it's a kind of intuitive idea. It's a bit of a joke. So again, this is actually from a firm, and this firm, they decided they would get rid of all of the streets in the neighborhood. They would have a parking structure, and they would have a crane with a massive claw, which would just pick up the cars and put them kind of where they are. It looks rather threatening, this kind of thing. And you see this parking structure with the cars kind of hanging up there. So it's a vision for the suburbs of the 1970s, where there are empty retail spaces, of what you could do with that space. But the intuition is that if you changed the car, then the street could become something like this, a kind of green space or more building space. And certainly, maybe some of the most interesting architectural features we find in cartoon books. Do you read graphic novels? Familiar? Yes, maybe you should be reading graphic novels because they're the best architects. So here is, I'm going to forget the guy's name, but anyway, here's Paris of the future. Everything is by, hydrogen balloons with wings that flap. And here they are boarding, and they're on the top of the building. And my point here is that the city is completely different if you change the transportation. So this kind of vision just shows you how completely different it would be if you have to come in the top of the building from the roof, and if that's the main concern. We already see it with light rail, which is a huge industry now all over the world, in developed as well as underdeveloped countries. These hybrid urban-rural landscapes also exist. They exist ad hoc. This is Chongqing, China. And you see gardening in between the buildings. It continues on a, every inch of China is farmed, every inch. Really amazing. The pace of development is incredible and fantastic. They don't build one apartment building, they build 20 or more in one go, and they're very high, they're 30 and 40 stories all the time. But the effect is to perpetuate a kind of environment where there is a mix, there's a kind of ecosystem that's still intact, despite the massive amount of development that's going on. There's still water flows and still agriculture going on, small scale. There's both large urban intervention and small scale interventions around it. So, so this might be a model worth thinking about. So the question about the car was, what if we change the dependence on the car? That would mean we wouldn't need so much space for peri-urban development. This is to produce hybrid environments so that peri-urban development is still agricultural. We change the spatialization of the urban. Here is in the United States. This is an agro-hood. So developers are creating actual projects where there are shared gardens in new developments, and they're extremely popular with younger families that want to have a garden. Many people participate. They want to have flowers in front of their house, but they still want to have a food garden. And they want to do this because they see this as more healthy, as a stress reduction. And so these are increasingly popular, and developers also use this as a way to negotiate construction. So it's an actual tangible solution to objections to development, is to say, okay, well, we're going to include an agricultural component. So this is these kind of gardens, like a community center, a kind of square parking area, and then houses. So they reduce the land area, the private land area, in this. This is called the Patch, this particular development in the States. I think you could imagine this as a gated community in Cairo. You could say, oh, okay, I can see what that is. And I'm happy to talk about gated communities further as we go. So what I've argued is, on the one hand, we have cities that are expanding, that are sprawling, but our imagination that we're using, certainly in the planning textbooks, is out of date. We're still planning a kind of traditional suburbia. We need to be planning a kind of for a peri-urban future. We're already on a planet where people live in peri-urban environments and they live quite densely. We have a reliance on the car. We need to think about that because that's one of the hidden drivers of this use of space, expansion, peri-urban expansion. You'll find to be effective, you need not just the tools of physical planning, but you need to understand the economics and the politics of real estate and power. Land is one of the circuits of capital. In fact, as we see people investing in land, land is somewhere you invest in for a long period of time. So you take your money out of the economy and you put it in land. That usually happens when people don't trust the rest of the economy. They don't trust finance, they don't trust manufacturing. But the result is money drains away from employment in making things and is put in concrete form in buildings. So it's called the land circuit of capital. I don't know if you cover this in your courses, maybe a little bit. But the result is that there's less money for business, less money for manufacturing, and employment falls. So you have unemployment, and then people go bankrupt, and then when this money that's in land becomes available, and it gets transferred into a new cycle where there's investment in manufacturing. So when you see big investments in land, what follows 20 years later is a crash in the valley. It's a structural cycle. So you need to be very aware that this is a cycle which has its own temporality. It goes at a certain speed. I said that people make decisions that are based on time in the marketplace decisions that are very short term. There are these structural cycles. And then there's the time of the city. And as architects and planners, your interest should be to safeguard that longer term periods of the city against the short term cycles, which always come with crises. I've argued for a new kind of space, one which is both urban and rural, and includes the agricultural, so that somehow on this planet where there are more and more people, we can have some other species, so that we have bees, for example, that will keep pollinating so we have food. Otherwise, we're going to be entirely in artificial food production produced out of who knows what, right? Produces synthetically. So these are some of the issues and some of the proposals in an area where there's no final answer at this point. I've given you a set of options and concerns. I'd love to hear your questions or your thoughts on how to go forward here. So thank you very much. Shukran. Thank you.
And in Egypt, we usually have been having the trend lately of how to market gated communities. So you were saying that in this design there are 3 types of gardens. I mean, one for flowers and one for agricultural products. What new techniques are used in Canada to advertise for commercial advertise for gated communities? Because this is a subject of interest to most investors. So what's new from the urban design point of view? How do we advertise? And because all of the commercials now are competing. Okay, of course they are talking about terrace houses, they are talking about duplex houses, they are talking about gardens on rooftops. So what's new from the commercial point of view? Because I think this is of much interest to Egyptians.
So I think what's new, and really this is the cutting edge, and what's new is sustainability. Sustainability is the key word. I think in terms of whether gated communities or simply peri-urban development, you really need a very powerful almost slogan or a cluster of ideas. I would suggest smart. Smart is a kind of keyword that everyone loves. Part of smart growth is to take that and make that mean sustainable urbanism. So smart cities are sustainable cities, and to put that together with the idea of having some kind of access to nature that is better than one can have as an individual family. Gardening is a lot of work. It's either you dedicate yourself to this, or you can't just come home at the end of the day and maintain successful food production. What you see here is that the houses are quite close together by North American standards, but they would sell the houses that are looking on the garden for more than they would sell the houses that are behind. With the idea, that even though you have the noise and the community activity close to your front door, you're still in some way in the center of action. Many young people are refusing to move to that house I showed you in the snow, and I had mentioned just being so far away from other things in the city, being completely reliant on the car. The idea that there are no activities are close around was also the idea behind revitalizing suburban shopping malls. How can you improve this? How can you make the 60s, 1970s North American suburb more sustainable? The answer is you can give it some walkable destinations. At this time, there's nothing you can walk to. The children even have to be driven to school. So just one thing, provide just one cafe, builds a sense of social solidarity, at least inside the neighborhood. I think that there are issues about social segregation. I think I think social spaces, this was mentioned, the role of social space and social centers as sites of solidarity. How do you link together a society that's dividing itself up spatially? And it's necessary to have the facilities that bring those communities together. Gardening can be one of them. So a garden, you can have an open day, come and see our garden. You can compare. You can sell the excess production because they produce far more than they can possibly eat. So it started as a grassroots hobby. It's well known in Germany. If you've been to Berlin, it's a kind of guerrilla gardening that has a very countercultural feel to it. In North America, it's been taken up as part of urban development. So in my city, for example, they've changed the rules to allow people to make gardens, to encourage them to make gardens, to encourage them to start thinking about agriculture in the city. So it's become quite mainstream in that way. And these are commercial developments. So you can come to my city in the snow, and you can go out and you can look at the agri-hood, you can look at these new developments that are peri-urban. So it's peri-urban sprawl, but you can see there it is. It's with gardens and very intensive gardening. Yeah.
Are the gardening areas dedicated by the city council, or is it private land? Or who dedicates the space for these garden spaces?
This garden would be owned collectively by the neighbors, but most garden spaces are owned by the city council. So this year, in the summer coming, the city has made all of its empty parking lots, all of the empty space that it owns, has made available for gardening. So if you fill in an application, they will bring fertilizer and compost and stuff, and you can make a garden there. It's an experiment. Nobody knows whether this will be successful. Some of us are a bit concerned because these parking lots are not, the soil is not the cleanest. It's a heavy equipment parking, so not quite sure what's going on there. But the city is responding to a pattern where people simply started to make these gardens. and the gardening is it's not just about food, it's an expression of self-identity and also ethnic identity. I mentioned you're bringing your elderly parents, they start gardening. The old people they garden, and it's a kind of compulsion. They're gardening, and so gardens just start expanding. When your parents are making a garden on your neighbor's front lawn, and then you have to go and say, sorry, but I think you should have some flowers. It's a very interesting neighbor experience. Either they like it, or you have to go say, sorry, take all this away. You come home and you ungarden. So we call these Ethnobirbee now, because we have in the pictures, the suburb I was showing, 87 different languages spoken in the schools. We're teaching in immersion 23. So we teach Arabic, the whole school curriculum, Chinese, Spanish, whatever, 23 different languages. Because we have so many communities, and there's enough to fill an entire school of students who speak Arabic, right, from grade 1 to 12. So that's a big change over 30 years in Canada. That these are no longer the white suburban middle class, but a kind of a new, we call it, say, new Canadians or first generation immigrant, very diverse, hyper diverse is the word we use.
You touched a bit on the Chinese experiment, on the Chinese multi-story housing next to the farms.
Yeah.
How would you elaborate on that? How do you see it? You said it might be the future of development. Do you have more about that?
The reason I mention it as maybe the future is because the Chinese are interested in exporting this model. So first of all, they imported American planning. If you go on if you look at Shenzhen, along the eastern coast, where all the electronics factories are, one finds American and in particular California planning. It looks like suburban Orange County, Costa Mesa, looks like the area around Los Angeles. They reproduced it, 8-lane roads, hedges, big amount of grass, all heavily irrigated, and then factory building. So, but as they have developed, they have a peculiar land tenure system where the land is, people can only lease land, for 75 years, and the lease can be ended at any moment. So the key people who control the land are mayors or village chiefs. They have no taxes, so the only way to get money as a mayor is to kick people off the land and sell it to a developer. In return for, okay, you build 20 buildings, you keep 3 for me, well, I'll keep 1 for myself as well. And so then they sell. This is really the heart of the economic process in China. It produces great wealth for the mayor and for the property developer, because in China, to be married, young men have to have a house or an apartment. So they need to buy, their families need to buy. So all families needed an apartment for themselves, and they wanted an apartment for their children, usually 1 child at that time. It's changed now. So the effect was also, it's very decentralized. The central state wanted to have industrial agriculture, so they wanted people to move out of the villages, or to make the villages smaller and more dense. And so you see in the middle of the countryside these tall towers, not just the big cities. Every village becomes these tall towers. They did no social research on this. They bulldozed, they covered over the family graves, which are the most important point of identity in China. These historic family graves, sometimes over 2,000 years old. They're gone, many of them, most of them. So we will see in the next generation, usually we have every 2 generations in Canada, people become interested in their roots. We have this phenomenon of going back to discover where did my family come from, and it's every 2 generations. So we'll see now their little children will see what they think of this loss of roots, which weren't well investigated, and that's now.
But it's interesting to make the comparison between the spread that
Yeah.
you talk about in Canada and the US, etc.,
Yes.
and the vertical, dense
Yeah.
communities that are springing around, especially in all over. What I don't know if we should call it the emerging world, not the underdeveloped world. Anyways, so I'm just this is where I wanted you to compare between this urban sprawl that you discuss and the dense vertical structures that replace the farms, that replace the peri-urban that you've talked about.
Yeah, very-
It's
very good.
interesting, and I'm interested in comparing those 2 models.
The other
and thinking
difference.
about them, how
Yeah.
in our case,
Yeah.
because neither work,
Right.
neither this nor that, so we have to be very careful about making our choices.
One of the differences is that the Chinese have a longer time frame. So they built all those buildings I showed in the pictures, but most of them are empty because they're built for 30 years. They don't expect them to fill up. But we could never build, and I'm sure in Cairo or Alexandria, you could never build a suburb for 30 years in advance. You build it for today, and in Canada, I said 118 days. It's got to be done. So.
But actually, we are having this model, especially Alexandria, because we have an extension to the west of the city, which is called Ragami, and exactly the same rationale, especially for investors. You will find a lot of these buildings, apartment buildings, empty, and they keep
Right.
on being vacant for 10 years in advance.
Yeah.
And it's always the idea that real estate investment does not get any cheaper. So if you construct now, you will gain your money.
Right.
Whether now or in the future, but you will always gain your money. So actually, this is a very
Yeah.
common point of view.
This is why the Chinese would want 3 apartments, but only one of those apartments would be livable. The rest are just concrete shells. They don't have any floors or ceilings or plumbing. It's just like a commercial space. That's very, very interesting. Yeah. In Korea, you have Hyundai cars. You can buy a Hyundai apartment building. And most importantly, they're working on facades. So they have copyright facade designs. You can have Egyptian, pharaonic, postmodern, glass and aluminum. You can have whatever style. And so they have these themed apartment buildings. And that's an export industry right now, mostly in East Asia. But they're aiming that they will sell these as branded